Well, hello, hello. I was just checking to see if I was muted or not because I've done that before. I'm not muted, so that's good. Everybody can hear me. Welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I'm Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, you can get a hold of me right there, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. For those of you listening, when I say right there, I'm pointing to my email address. But feel free to send me an email, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. Any questions, comments, ideas for future podcasts, course lessons, whatever you like. Or just say hi. I'd love to hear from you. For those of you watching live right now, happy Friday. Today is Friday. Woohoo! We got the weekend coming up. So today we're going to have a conversation all about content engineering. And you're probably wondering, what is content engineering? And why is that important to me? Those are two great questions, which today we're going to answer, especially if you're working with headless CMSs. And the answers will be given by my guest, John Collins. He's a senior content architect at Atlassian, and I hope I pronounced that. I can never pronounce that company correct. He just nodded that I did it all right, so we're good. We're good to go there. But before we get started, you know how this works. I'm gonna give you a little marketing because I got to tell you about headlesscreator.com, and then we'll jump into the interview. But go get your free account. You can see John right there. You can find out all the podcast episodes up here. I do podcasts in English, and I just started doing them in Spanish as well. So you can find en español if you are interested there. Also, you'll find all the courses, and I offer tons of courses there. They're all free. Everything here is 100% free. You'll have access to Content Modeling Weekly course, where everybody knows I'm a content modeling geek, and I just love to do this for fun on the weekends. I know I need to get a life. And then all the focus on headless CMS courses, right? So content stack, contentful, data CMS, all of them right there. And then, of course, the Discover Headless Tech course, you'll have access to that, which has not only all the interviews that you see here, but also a bunch of tutorials as well. So anyway, enough of this. I just wanted to tell you so you know where to get your account. And then this podcast episode would be available on demand on headlesscreator.com. So get your account and you'll be able to get it there. Also, I do want to remind you to go ahead and there's a chat. We're live. So for those of you watching or listening live, get your put your questions on chat, and if we have time, I'll get to those questions with John. That's it. I won't mention that you should get your free account at headlesscreator.com anymore. All right, with that said, I'm going to bring on John. John, welcome. Oh, you know what?
Yes, there we go.
I forgot to unmute you. See, and I was messing with that. There we go. All right.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
I'm glad to have you here. I've seen you all over the place on the internet. Like, John is everywhere. And you're always talking about things that I'm passionate about: content strategy, content modeling. And then you mentioned to me, there's this thing called content engineering, which you've started, to talk about. And I'm like, that's intriguing, because those are my two favorite things: content and working with engineers. Like, what does that mean? So I know we're going to get into all of that real soon. But before we get started, give us a little bit about your background. Like, what do you do at Atlassian? What do you do there? How did you get there? What did you do before?
Yeah, so my current role as senior content architect is really about starting to bring more structure into our content and connecting content across the internal silos, to use one of the buzzwords of the industry of silos. But to start to connect that content in the content management system so that we can start building better experiences for our users. I came into that via kind of a content background. If you go back to the earliest days, I was actually a journalist. I ran a small weekly newspaper. Loved that, but was looking for something that had a better work-life balance and better provided for my family. And so I had taken a technical writing course in college and kind of enjoyed that. I thought maybe there's something in tech that I could do with that. So I made that switch to a technical writer, quickly started writing content that I thought, if the user experience were different, this would be easier to write or less to write. So got into the user experience world, did a lot of UX writing kinds of work, um, and kind of was doing content strategy. I was helping our team transition from managing content in Adobe InDesign files and PDFs into some help authoring tools and kind of single sourcing content there. And that kind of led me into the world about thinking about the content and how it's stored and how it's structured. And eventually they ended at Atlassian, and I was still doing content design work as part of a product design team. But then a position opened up with a new team that has kind of morphed into the role that I'm in today over a series of years.
What kind of stories did you cover as a journalist?
Oh, you name it. The boring town meetings, which was actually part of my pitch when I was becoming technical writer. If I
Yeah.
can make a government meeting compelling and understandable, then I can make your software understandable.
Right.
But one of my passions was really narrative journalism, telling stories about people's lives and
Mm.
how bigger themes impacted everyday people, breaking news, fires, murders, all those kinds of things.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that stood out during your intro, which is a word that really resonates with me, is silos, because that happens in a lot of companies.
Mhm.
And with a headless CMS, and we'll get into content engineering in just a second, but with a headless CMS, you can't have silos, because then you're implementing a headless CMS as a traditional legacy CMS where you're going to have no single source of truth. You're going to have duplicate content, right? I mean,
Yes, exactly.
so so you said your one of your duties and goals is to break silos. Do you have tips? Are you on your way to doing that? I mean, in an enterprise, and Atlassian is a large enterprise, obviously.
Yeah, uh,
It's hard to do sometimes, right?
it is. And I mean, you listen to just about any content related podcast, and it all boils down to content as a people problem. And so the people skills are important. I think maybe we'll hit on that a little bit later as well. But I'd say we're in the early stages of that, and I think content engineering is a way to break some of those silos. What I tend to say, my spiel is, you know, people talk about content silos are a bad thing, and I would generally agree. Business silos may also be a bad thing, but I think we need to accept that they're a fact of life and look for how to connect those silos. So that's kind of the approach I'm taking, is seeing what commonalities there are across silos and trying to start there.
Yep, that's good tip. Good. Well, let's jump in. Before we jump into content engineering, I mean, we have these titles like content design, strategy,
Mhm.
operations engineering, all of this kind of stuff. So tell us, like, what are those jobs, and how do they relate to content engineering in general, or do they?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been talking recently about four emerging roles, and I frame it as roles because people can kind of shift between roles sometimes, and it may depend on the size project you're on or the size company you're on. You may be filling all roles, you may be filling one role. And so I usually, just real quickly, I describe content design as focusing on creating content that meets a user's need. And that content might be words or images, infographics, video, etc. Not just words. Um, but then there's content strategy, which is also about user needs, but it's applying more of a business lens. Like, what is the business trying to accomplish with this content? And I think it's important that to talk about content strategy as defining content needs that serve business goals and user needs. If you do one or the other, but not both, then you have content that's not particularly as quality as it could be. And I think it leads to a proliferation of content or resentment of some of the content. But content strategy and content design overlap in my view. There is some strategy in content design, and there are some content strategists that work with their hands in content, but there are others who stay kind of a level above actual content creation. And then you have content operations, which I describe as getting content into a content management system and out to users. And it's more about people, processes, tools, workflows, and those kinds of things. And then lastly, we have content engineering, and we'll go into much more depth about that. But that is the idea of organizing the shape, structure, and application of content. And I would say this happens whether you're in WordPress or working in UI strings, or if you're in Google Docs, or I work at Atlassian, you did say it correctly, Confluence pages or PDFs. Some of those have more inherent structure than others, but there is some sort of shape and structure in all of those. And so those four disciplines I see as kind of four overlapping circles, and some people fill a role that's in the middle of all four circles, and others have the luxury or the ability to kind of start specializing and work specifically within one of those circles. And I talk about them as roles, not job titles, because I think there's a number of job titles that
Right.
can fit inside those circles, depending on your company and your specialization and all of those kinds of things. So to me, it's helpful to recognize that these all exist, and that we do all of these sometimes, or that we're narrowing down on a specific one of them.
It's interesting about those roles because I think most companies do have like the design and strategy hands down, but the operations part is I think where most companies are missing on. When people think of content, they think of just, publishing marketing content, but there's content related to applications that you need to have an operations process. When you're releasing code, you want content to go along with it. And I think that's where a lot of companies are missing out on, and having these processes in place, because they have all these processes in place, CI/CD for code, right? Well, we need a similar thing for content. What's your thought on
Exactly.
that?
Yeah, to be honest, like, this idea of these four roles came when I started hearing about content operations 2, 3 years ago, maybe. And I was kind of thinking, I've been doing content strategy and content design. Do we really need another content thing? But then when I started understanding more what it was about, I think it's more and more important. It's an area that, like, I don't see how we can not be talking about it.
Right.
It's not something I want to be very deep in myself, but um, I think sometimes it's the way into a large content project, and having the discussions that lead to content strategy discussions and content design discussions. So I think it's a really important area. I think it is emerging in the last few years. Uh, I'm in a large enterprise, as we mentioned, so I have a little bit of a luxury to be thinking about it kind of as a specialty, and
Right.
many people aren't. They're in smaller companies, and stuff just happens kind of
They're deep in the
organically.
weeds, right? They
Yeah.
can't think about that. Yeah, and I want to challenge everybody listening here today and in the future about when they think about content, of any kind of content, don't think about marketing only. Think about all content. That includes product content, right? There's so much product related content, micro copy, field labels, errors, all that kind of stuff that's really content that you need to figure out. And I think this leads into the next question, which is, and I think that's why there's the mixture of content and engineering, right? But I mean, you kind of defined it, but define it a little bit more. What is content engineering? What do you consider content engineering?
Yeah. So I can kind of frame it two ways. Uh, the way that I want to probably spend the most time is borrowed from Chris Saunders, from the agency A, his website Simple A. Um, he talks about 7 disciplines of content: model, metadata, markup, schema, taxonomy, topology, and graph. And that kind of breaks down a lot of what I see that I've been doing for the last few years before I completely even had that framing of it. So we can go more in depth there. The other framing that I would give, if people are familiar with the knowledge management world, I kind of describe it as taxonomy and ontology. And those are the things that kind of are the underpinning of the structure of content. And then the content model is how those ontologies and taxonomies get rendered in systems. So those are kind of the two framings that I use, but I'd love to go deeper there in the 7 disciplines.
So let's get into the model because that's something that's dear and close to my heart. But let's start with that. What do you mean by the content model?
Yeah, when I think of content model, I kind of frame it a couple ways. At its core, it's how content types and relationships between content types are modeled or represented. Um, but I tend to think of there's a content model of a content type. So what fields are in this content type? And then there's what is the relationship between this content model and that content model and all the different content types that are in the system. How do they relate to each other? And so I think of there's like that granular content model and then the kind of uber content model. I also sometimes I find it useful to talk about the fidelities of content models. So just like designers have mock-ups and wireframes and things like that, there's kind of levels of fidelity of content models in my mind. So if you are looking at maybe an existing page in a website, you could start breaking that down into what structured chunks are there so that you could model that in a content model. And that feels to me kind of equivalent to a wireframe for a designer. The highest level of fidelity is what does it take to actually implement this content model in a CMS? What kind of field validations are there and those kinds of things.
And so within the content model, and I'm going to stay with this a little bit more because this is obviously I have the content modeling weekly course and this is my passion, but I want to challenge people to think outside that page and to think of what content belongs in this page, not how do we model this page in the content model, right? So in other words, what content drives this page? And then you start thinking, well, where else can we use this content outside of this page? Whether it's in different delivery channels or integration with other systems. What are your thoughts on that? And what kind of tips when you're modeling with your stakeholders, what kind of tips can you give to provide this single source of truth, scalable content model?
Yeah.